Well, good afternoon, good morning. This is Eric Ducharme. I'm a member of the planning committee and also a co-chair, along with Dr. May, of this important workshop. This afternoon session uh, is on the activities of the sponsors of panels or of programs for minority engineers, and how we can focus on collaborating and creating that systems approach that Dr. Reed talked about. I'd like to thank the organizing committee and the Sloan Foundation. We had some great opening discussions and welcoming remarks from Dr. Anderson, from Dr. Pierre, from Dr. May, and a great keynote from Dr. Reed. So I'm looking forward to a great panel discussion here. And just a bit about myself. I'm a member of the National Academy. I have recently retired from GE Aviation as the chief engineer, responsible for product safety, technical talent development, and all of the discipline that goes into creating an important system like an aircraft engine, as well as the regulatory compliance and those aspects. I've also got experience with working with Dr. May and Beth and the team at the NAE on working on a study on pathways through engineering, education, and careers, and the different avenues and pathways of how engineers are educated, where they end up, and how they stay or leave the engineering profession. So that's a good foundation for this, in that we also looked at the aspect of the um, uh, ethnicity, the underrepresented minorities, and their pathways as well. I'd like to just quickly highlight that we have a great panel, and I'll go into some more discussion on their bios and so forth, which are in the reference material here. But we've got Laurel Espinosa, who's a program director at the Sloan Foundation. We've got Rosalind Hudnall, who's the retired as the Chief Diversity Officer and President from the Intel Corporation, and Christine Hunt, who's a Program Director at the NSF. If you could bring up my slides, please. I've just got a couple of quick slides. I wanted to highlight the efforts of the GE Foundation, and this is activity that is very recent, in the past year or so since I have retired. But GE has had a strong foundation of supporting education within the communities where they have a presence. And that's been an ongoing effort for decades. And I think there was an assessment a couple of years back of, is it having the impact that we're looking for in terms of these investments and these commitments and the support that we're providing in the pipeline of STEM talent into our different businesses. So we did a pivot a couple of years ago and launched something called the Next Engineers programs. And it's a $100 million program that we are looking to impact 85,000 students in 25 different countries. And it is taking that kind of longitudinal view of how you engage young people, especially diverse young people, along their pathway of education. Starting early on, as we all know, with the engineering discovery program that really engages engineering or interested people to create increased awareness and understanding of what engineering is all about. So again, it's tapping into the different communities in which we are located. And by the way, this is going to be piloted in 4 locations: Cincinnati, Ohio, Greenville, South Carolina, Johannesburg, South Africa, and in the UK in Staffordshire. We've got obviously a global presence, and we're looking to make this impact global. That would then follow on with an engineering camp activity, which is focused at the ages of 14 to 15, where we have a week-long camp experience and provide a further understanding, a further insights into what engineering is all about and the sort of important problems that you could solve with that skill set. And then building on that, an engineering academy, which is an over 3-year program, 80 hours outside of school, engaging with these students on the topics that you see there: engineering, design thinking, creativity, problem solving, teamwork and collaboration, making and building, and then also communicating. Building on this, next slide, please. We see offering internships to students who complete this program and show an interest and want to follow up, provide paid internships. And then we are partnering with the local universities within these cities so that we can provide $20,000 type of scholarships for these students, and also have opportunity to co-op and that sort of thing. So this is a kind of a pivot that the GE Foundation has done in its approach, taking more of that longitudinal pathway view, focusing more on STEM, and obviously looking to identify diverse students to bring into the program. And it's really getting started. So it's early to say what the outcomes are, but the expectation is that we'll have a stronger pipeline developed because of this. So you can drop the slides now. I'll just do a quick introduction of our panel members. Laurel Espinosa is a program director at the Sloan Foundation, where she is responsible for developing and implementing evidence-based programs and for the foundation's grant making that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM education. Prior to joining the foundation in 2020, she was the vice president for research at the American Council for Education and has over 20 years of experience in higher education practice, policy, and research. She's a national voice on issues pertaining to college access and success for diverse populations, and on the role of equity-minded leadership in post-secondary settings. So we're really fortunate to have Laurel with us. Rosalind Hudnall is a recognized global thought leader for diversity and inclusion. As Intel's first chief diversity officer, she delivered the industry leading strategy, which launched the $1 billion Diversity in Technology Initiative. And she's got deep expertise in workforce development. She had a 2-decade-long career at Intel, and that led to her being the vice president of human resources and the president of the Intel Foundation. So we're fortunate to have Rosalind with us as well. Christine Grant is a professor of chemical and biological engineering at NC State, and she also serves as a program director for the NSF. She's conducted research in surface and interfacial science, and has been advising students and postdocs from the high school to the graduate student level. She is a president-elect of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, a life member of that, SWE, and she's a fellow of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. She's a change agent who's been active as a principal investigator on multiple NSF advanced grants and served on the advisory board with many schools. So welcome, Christine. So again, we have a great panel. Looking forward to their comments and to a robust discussion around how these various programs can work together to achieve the goals of this workshop. So with that, I will invite Laurel.
Great. Well, thanks for having me back up on the stage. It's nice to see everyone again. And thanks for pulling up the slides. I'll just say first, if you don't know Sloan, the Sloan Foundation, we make grants primarily to support original research and education related to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and economics. The foundation believes that these fields and the scholars and practitioners who work in them are chief drivers of the nation's health and prosperity. And as such, we are deeply concerned with the health of the communities that conduct this research, and we are deeply concerned with the discrimination and exclusion that too many individuals in these communities face, namely women and underrepresented people of color, which is why we are all here today to solve for that problem. So that's where the higher education program at Sloan comes in, which is exclusively focused on DEI and STEM, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, let me just give you a brief preview of what I want to cover. We can go to the next slide. So I want to share a few findings from a couple of commissioned landscape scans that we did to inform the higher education program strategy. I'm going to share the strategic priorities of the program as well as our major investment areas. Next slide, please. This is the program's goal, so this will ground us all in where we are sitting. Our goal is to create diverse, equitable, and inclusive pathways to and through STEM graduate education and the professoriate. So that is where we're focused. Next slide, please. And onto the landscape scans that I mentioned. So the first one, and you can actually go to the next slide because I have a couple of thumbnails of what they look like. They're on the Sloan website. The first one was really looking at the landscape for investments in DEI, STEM, higher education, and specifically, or actually, this is the second one on the slide, the one on the very right, but specifically the pathways that we've mentioned so many times already today. And anyone who's interested in that investment landscape will want to take a look at that. And then knowing that we are going to stay focused on graduate education, we also commissioned a landscape of effective practices around DEI in US STEM graduate education, again, specifically for the populations that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. Great. So this graphic, and you might need to enlarge your screen to see it, is one that showed up in the investments landscape. And the reason I wanted to share it today and for this workshop is because it does a nice job of laying out the many actors who reside in the spaces that we're talking about, the many actors that we know need to work together to form that collective impact that Carl Reed talked about. So just food for thought for you. But it was a nice way for us to situate where Sloan resides in this landscape. And I'll just walk you through the figure quickly. So at the center are entities with the largest concentration of DEI efforts or who make the largest dollar investments. So this would be the NSF, for example, but also professional societies who focus specifically on DEI, like the National Society of Black Engineers. One ring out, you have entities who have a less concentrated focus on DEI, but who are very important to this work. Private philanthropy resides here, so Sloan Foundation, as do colleges and universities. And the last ring out are influential actors, and they're perhaps the least focused specifically on DEI. For example, private corporations who have, again, may have a DEI focus. It's not their primary goal. But all of these actors have a role to play in the work that we're talking about today. And it was a nice way for us to see where we sit in the ecosystem. By the way, the white circles are the funders, and the gold circles are influencers, and the white and gold bars denote exemplar models. So this is also in that paper that you saw a moment ago on the screen. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about where we saw some of the gaps in grant making approaches and investments, specifically at the private philanthropy level, which is again where Sloan resides. So many of the players on that bullseye image are doing a lot in this space. They are funding a great deal in this space. The report details where they're funding. But to say something about the gaps, which were important factors, again, to Sloan in finding our niche and where we want to play a role, the report found that funding gets less and less concentrated as we go up the so-called pipeline, or what I like to call the pathway. So that would mean that there's a great deal of funding and attention at K-12. There's a great deal at the undergraduate level. There's dramatically less at the graduate level and the professoriate. So we are going to stay focused at Sloan on the grad and the professoriate for that reason. It's also the case that investments overall are largely focused on the individual and not on the systems and the cultures within which these individuals reside. So you saw that, I don't have to explain it more, because you saw that in Carl Reed's presentation about this focus on the individual and not on the systems. And I'm going to say a few more things about systems as we go. And if you follow the money, we also see that few private funders are investing in DEI, STEM, higher education. And when they are, it's in the same handful of institutions. So over half of the dollars that go towards DEI and STEM higher education are going to the same 10 institutions. This is out of the private sector, the private philanthropic sector, but there is a version of this at the federal level as well in the agency community. Next slide, please. Okay, just to say a little bit more about that second report before I get into our priorities. It was trying to address this question about what the literature says about what works in reducing disparities, supporting inclusion, and increasing diversity in STEM pathways into and through graduate education. And next slide, please. So the scan identified 3 major areas of evidence. And I think as you see them, we can probably all agree that these are right ones. Carl Reed would probably agree, yes, as you said, there's so much evidence that we know about what works. But if we wanted to bucket them out, we might start first with the interventions that are serving individual students or student groups. This is where most of the funding has gone, like I said. These are experiences or offerings that tend to have a positive record for the students who have access to them, things like research experience and financial support, things that Sloan certainly funds as well. Next slide, please. The next effective area is what we might call institutional change efforts. So individual efforts or interventions like changes in admissions policy or providing learning and professional development opportunities for students and faculty. And still a great deal of investment here, less investment than in the individual efforts. This is what can contribute to systems change, but isolated won't do that. You know, isolated efforts don't equal that collective impact that Carl Reed talked about. But let's go to the next slide and I'll tell you the third effective area is what the authors called enhancing structures and cultures of support. So this would be things like high quality faculty-student relationships, which according to one study is the single strongest determinant of whether a student will complete the PhD. So let's go to the next slide. So after thinking about these 3 areas, and I hope everyone goes and takes a look at the report, I just want to talk about the disconnects again, because this is what feeds right into Sloan's priorities, which I'll share next. But you see the disconnects. It turns out that we know much more about patchwork programs that serve small groups of students than about systemic change efforts that have the potential to transform STEM environments. And again, systemic change is going beyond the individual and thinking about the multi-layered, complex environments that the individuals reside in. And this is true that we know less because we're funding less research on this, but we're also funding less programmatic efforts on this. This is all related, right? In terms of what gets funded, what gets executed on, and what gets studied. And so that's where we get into the strategic priorities. And you can go 2 slides ahead, actually. There we go. So with all of that in mind and more, things I can't get into in 10 minutes, our first priority is to invest in widening pathways to graduate education. Our second is to empower universities to transform STEM graduate education, and this includes refinement to our signature programs, which I'll talk about in a moment, The third is to pursue innovative efforts to diversify the STEM professoriate. The fourth is where I would like to see us lead the way in systemic change efforts. So these are those very efforts that have gone understudied and underinvested in. And it's not only investing in those efforts, but it's also looking through our grant making, looking through a lens of systemic change when we make our grants. And so that's something that we're actively working on defining right now. The fifth is to examine our own practices. And this is something that every funder should be doing to make sure that we're not reinforcing inequities in the way that we do our grant making. And that's especially important in the private philanthropic sector, which is often a very opaque black box for many people. And finally, we are well poised to refocus our energies on racial equity in particular, given the current environment we find ourselves in. And I know that is our focus today as well. And here we are making a grant to focus on that. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to do this in a few ways, actually more than a few ways, but just to say three of them. One is, like I said, pursuing grant making with that systemic change lens. But the next one is just as important, which is to emphasize the institutions we invest in as those that have been doing the work for a very long time. And those institutions are minority serving institutions and other institutions who may not be minority serving, but who have a track record of attracting and admitting and graduating underrepresented students of color, again, Black, Latinx, Indigenous students in STEM fields. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, one thing that we're doing to advance this approach. And the third thing is to collaborate and coordinate with other funders. So Sloan is a small foundation. We have finite resources, just like the other funders you'll hear from today. And we're very interested in achieving greater impact through what we do with other funders. And so let's go to the next slide and then the slide after that, because I want to talk about our signature initiatives. So the first one is the University Centers of Exemplary Mentoring. This was started in 2013. It has served about 713 students since that start. It's currently on 8 campuses. And you can see the target populations here. This is a model that brings together STEM departments. So when the USTEM proposal comes to us from an institution, that institution has brought together STEM departments, a number of them, up to one USTEM has up to 21 departments working together to really change the way that they do graduate education, to change their policies, their practices, advance mentoring. And what you can see in the second bullet is the nuts and bolts of the program. It's to provide financial support. So the Sloan dollars go to student scholarships that the institution then matches with a matched scholarship. These programs are also characterized by structured mentoring approaches. It's usually a team mentoring approach, a supportive community. This is a cohort model that is employed here, and that and other things create a supportive environment that's very cohesive for the students. And then institutional commitment. Each USTEM is required to have a dean level commitment. Half of them have the lead PIs as the graduate dean. So institutional commitment, change readiness is very important for us as well. And I should mention that when I commissioned those studies, I also commissioned an evaluation of this program. Those results will be coming to us in a couple of months. We'll then be doing some redesign and putting out a call for nominations later this year, so sometime in the fall. So for individuals who are interested in that call, look out for it. It'll be around the fall. We can go to the next slide. The next is the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, and this is a program that has been in place since 2003. Its target populations are American Indian, Alaska Native, master's and doctoral students, whereas the USTEM, a moment ago I mentioned, is doctoral only. This is also for masters. This program seeks to strengthen and expand university initiatives to recruit, train, and graduate Indigenous students. And it's similar to the USTEM in that we provide scholarship support, and the campus provides strong community support. And in fact, the 9 campuses who are SIGP campuses work in concert with one another very closely to also create that strong community support. We've served about 405 students since the start of this program. And the aspiration, and I think the reality on many of these campuses, is that this program is rooted in and driven by Indigenous communities and cultures striving to not only improve outcomes educationally, but also improve outcomes as it pertains to the Indigenous communities that these programs touch. This one is not going up for a call for nominations in the near future, but it's something to know about because we are interested in bringing on new campuses in the future. So if there's interest in this one, you can feel free to reach out to me. And then the third one, which is my last slide, and is a thank you, is there's a call for letters of inquiry out right now with a May 1 deadline. So this is one to definitely be knowing about. This is called Creating Equitable Pathways to STEM Graduate Education. And this is really about those minority serving institution pathways to graduate education, master's and doctoral in the case of this program. And certainly engineering has, as we saw on the call that we did last year, engineering shows up a lot at the master's level, given how much students can do with a master's degree in engineering. But we're also very interested in doctoral programs and in pathways to the professoriate. There's 3 giving levels for this program: planning grants, seed grants, and implementation grants. And they're a lot like what they sound like in terms of what you should be prepared to do. These are partnerships between MSIs and graduate programs. Last year, most of the graduate programs were at predominantly white institutions, but we also saw MSIs partnering with one another to create those strong pathways. Strong faculty collaboration is very important for this. As we know, when it comes to admitting students in graduate education, those faculty connections really carry the day. And we're also very interested in seeing that the graduate program is taking a systemic change approach when it comes to what this pathway or these pathways and what the partnership looks like, so that when students arrive to the graduate program, they are supported and thriving. We made 20 grants in this program last year in 2021 that are supporting more than 60 institutions in partnership with one another. So we will be making a similar number of grants this year. Once again, the call for letters of inquiry is out, and the deadline is May 1st. Okay, so with that, you can go to the last slide, which is my thank you slide, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. We're going to switch to our next speaker, Dr. Grant. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Christine.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. As my colleagues said, I am on the faculty at North Carolina State. I've been there for about 30 years as an engineering faculty member. And I wanted to actually, I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see here. All right, everyone seeing that okay? And you can hear me? Yes?
You're in edit mode. If you can just start your presentation, please.
Oh. Is that? You told me to get into which mode? I'm sorry.
So we can do the screen share for you if you'd like. So Fran will bring up your slides for you.
Well, I'll have to keep saying. Just tell me one last time, where would I go to change the setting?
It's in the slideshow settings, but we do have your screen sharing, so you can just let Fran know when to advance. We already have that display.
Use presenter view. That's what you want me to do?
So we're already doing your screen share, so we're happy to do the screen share for you.
All right. Okay, so getting back on track. Thank you so much for that help. So I wanted to say a couple of things before I start my slides, because there's so much of a connection between the folks who spoke before me. And I have to tell you that I went to college in 1980. And for my colleague Eric at GE was like part of my life. I'm taking off my NSF hat for a minute to tell you I was in the program to increase minority engineering graduates, which was sponsored by General Electric. And in that program, we went on field trips to RPI, to UMass Amherst. I did a minority introduction to engineering at UMass Amherst and at Northeastern University, where Carl is now. I got a scholarship to go to Brown University. I worked at GE at the Research and Development Center. I'm a third generation GE. My grandfather worked in large steam turbine. My mother was a technical editor, a biology teacher, but she was a technical editor. And so I got to work at GE for 5 summers. And I also was a GEM fellow with GE and then with Procter & Gamble. So, you know, maybe I don't have to show any slides. I could just talk about what I did in terms of the different programs and how they impacted me. But that's a really interesting connection. There's an NSBE connection to Gary May. Gary was finishing up at Georgia Tech when I was starting there as a graduate student. And I knew Carl when we were in NSBE as presidents together. I was at Brown, he was at MIT. So the journey continues, the work that we've been doing. Some of us have been doing this work for 30, 40 years now, although we look like we're 20, right? Okay. All right, so next slide. I am a program director in broadening participation in engineering directorate at NSF. So I'm putting my NSF hat on now. This is the organization of the director for engineering. Some of these names may have changed, but basically we have an assistant director, and then we have these 5 divisions, but now we actually have 4. You can click on the next. We actually have 4 because we have a new directorate. You probably heard about it, TIP, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, that just started. So that IIP group, the majority of them are going over to this new directorate. Next. I live in engineering education and centers, and that is where I'm going to talk about the programming that we do in there and broadening participation. Next. So engineering education and centers has 4 groups. We have the centers and networks. We have engineering education, workforce development, and broadening participation. And we also have some folks from IIP that have come over. So some of you may be familiar with the engineering research centers, where we do some broadening participation as well. Next. My program, which is broadening participation, seeks to strengthen the future of the engineering workforce. We have several different funding mechanisms. And so in the time that I have, I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding mechanisms and some new programs that we have going on. Similar to what we've been talking about all day, increasing the access to engineering, understanding the barriers, and transforming engineering cultures. And we have a lot of different funding mechanisms, the unsolicited research where you can submit, career proposal, planning grants, eagers, rapids. For those of you who are familiar with the NSF culture, you know what that means. For those of you who are not, I'm going to move on, next slide, to tell you about a new program that just came out last year. Broadening participation in engineering. We now have a solicitation and we have the same goal, but I want to talk about these 4 tracks of funding. The first track is planning and conference grants. There is no submission deadline, and those are typically between $50,000 and $100,000 to help you to plan for a submission of a larger proposal later, or to do a conference or workshop. The second track is research on broadening participation in engineering. Again, no submission deadline. That's what most people were doing in the past. That's where we had most of our funding. And that ranges from $300,000 to $400,000. The new thing, which we're really excited about, the new things are track 3, which is the inclusive mentoring hubs. That's new, and that's going to be about $800,000. And then track 4, which has phase 1 and phase 2, and phase 1 is $1.2 million. We have target dates for those. The first target date was in January of this year. So we just received a bunch of proposals that we're going to be reviewing. There's another target date later this year, and then it will be annually. So the mentoring hubs we're really trying to bring people together who are doing inclusive and amazing work in the mentoring realm. I know the National Academies had a report that came out I got to participate in on mentoring a year or so ago. And the idea is for people to come together with the best practices and to work as a group or as a team. The Centers for Equity in Engineering, track 4, which is also new, is a larger scale initiative. And the thing that's really interesting about that is that the dean is the PI. And so we want this to be something that's going to go across engineering, not just a PI over here. We also are including an incentive later on for people to work across institution types, whether it's HBCUs, MSIs, HSIs as well. Next slide. So we have a lot of different programs. So we're trying to impact the engineering directorate across all the divisions. And so the things that I do as a program director include portfolio management, my own program. I work in cross-foundational activities for the advanced program includes and HBCU EIR, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then we have some new projects that we've been working on in partnership with NASA, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we do collaborations across engineering as well. So that's where I sit and the things that I work on across the foundation. Next slide. So when we look at we want to see broadening participation in all of our divisions. They're all doing it. And all together, that means we're doing broadening participation in engineering overall. Okay, next slide. This is just a few example projects that have come out of our portfolio. This slide I produced in preparation for a conversation with the Hispanic Latino community. So you'll see some of these projects looked at broadening participation, engineering, a qualitative study on Latino presence in and beyond the degree, investigating the barriers to retention and tenure for Black and Hispanic engineering faculty at R1 institutions. That's another study. But I will encourage you to go to the database, nsf.gov, and go and do a search, and under the program element code, put in 7680, because that's my program. And look and just see the different things that we're funding. Next slide. So a couple of programs. Beth, this is Beth's program, Sharing Exemplary Admissions Practices that Promote Diversity in Engineering, is a project that she led with a number of different institutions. Next slide. There are also projects that are focused on who gets to be an engineer. So we have a career awardee, Jeremy London, who did a project or has a project looking at who gets to be an engineer. I mean, how do we think about this, and how do we process, and how do we make this happen so that we have people going down the pathway? We also have a project that was funded that was done by the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, APLU, looking at the status report on engineering education. That's another one that you might want to look at. Next slide. So there's another program that we participate in, HBCU EIR. The primary goal of this program is to have researchers at HBCUs come in and do submit proposals for funding. There is a letter of intent, and there's some feedback sometimes that they may get on that, or they may have some conversations. We may have some webinars to help with some elements of the preparation of the final proposal, and then they submit the final proposal, and it's not a separate program. The funding comes from a different source, but they are able to have their proposals evaluated alongside non-HBCUs. And so it's a different program, and we've been doing it for a few years now. Next slide. We also have a program that, eFellows program for postdoctoral researchers that we started last year. Next slide. And then there's the Includes Network that Dr. Reed mentioned earlier. And there are several different ways that folks have been able to get involved with this Includes project. It's a partnership with 8 federal agencies. Next slide. And it turns out, and Dr. Reed mentioned this, that the first engineering alliance went to Northeastern University, and you'll see the team. Those are the folks that Dr. Reed mentioned earlier. So this is the first one. Next, you can click it twice. Yeah. Thanks. So, of course, we know that the data suggests that the engineering workforce does not match the diversity of the country as a whole. Big surprise, right? That's why we're all here. Next. We actually have partnered up with NASA in the Includes program, and we are building MSI-led coalitions to strengthen and broaden participation in engineering. So this is another project that we have. Next slide. So this just gives you some information on the next slide about, can you click it again, about how we are working together. I encourage you to look it up, look up NASA and NSF Includes, and you'll come to this website that has more information about planning grants and actual proposals in the MURAP program. Next slide. And for additional information, you can contact me. You can look up the new Broadening Participation Solicitation. And there's a webinar that we did last year that'll give you some more information. So again, thank you for having me. And I'm really excited to be here. And my time is up. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That was great. Next, we'll ask Rosalind Hudnall to come up and share her thoughts.
Well, great. Thank you for having me. Christine, you are like the case study perfect example of if we could do for you, for everyone, we might not all have to be here. So it's really an honor to be here. And what I thought I could do when Dr. May asked me to participate on this is to kind of talk a little bit about kind of what I learned. I retired, it's almost been 4 years from Intel. I still am connected to this issue. I think I always will be connected to this issue. But I look back on this now and see things from both the glass being half full and the glass being half empty. And one of the things that I had the honor of doing is really leading a funding effort for Intel, provided resources to many, many different collaborations and organizations. And I had the honor of serving on the GYM board and NACME and doing tremendous work with tremendous teams of brilliant engineers to try and close this gap. And so at Intel, just a little bit of a history. So Intel's formed in 1968 in the height of the civil rights movement. Andy Grove valued education deeply. And so Intel was formed always with this part of our corporate responsibility was to build a pipeline of engineers into this country as an immigrant, him coming in, went to CUNY and did a phenomenal amount of work, started Intel. And then over time, when I first came into Intel, I worked at Baird, and of course, Craig came from Stanford. And so academic preparation and the value for education was a huge part of Intel's philanthropy. As a matter of fact, 80% of Intel's philanthropy went into either K-12 or higher ed. When I came into Intel, though, it wasn't on BIPOC populations the way that the data would have assumed it should be. And so Intel began to do much more funding outside of our site communities. Most corporations start their philanthropic footprint around the neighborhoods where they are. And Intel happened to be in areas that were not very diverse. And so for literally the first 40 years of the company, we had a focus, but it wasn't a deep commitment in our focus. And so as we began to branch out and as we began to really look at diversity and inclusion, we began to look at data and began to put more of our emphasis in our K-12 area and our higher education area in really getting more students of color, particularly African-American students, to complete their engineering degree. And we started with money because money matters. I think we were one of the largest funders of scholarships in this country at all level, undergrad, masters, and PhDs, and probably still are. I haven't seen the data over the last few years, but that's really what we did. We went and said money matters. But as we really stepped back, what we recognized also was it wasn't just money, but it was mentorships and advocacy and policy. We began to be very involved in policy at the local, state, and national level that impacted access to education and specifically impacted our ability to channel our resources by race. And as you know, that became increasingly more difficult, particularly in California. But as we really began to step back and began to look at the fact that we were continuing to fund the same things, and yes, we were one of the organizations that were funding the same institutions, what we also began to recognize was it was hard to drive systemic change in a system that is not focused on systemic change broadly, meaning that we had to go drive systemic change at the K-12 area, one district at a time. Then we had to get to one college system at a time, one university system at a time, one private university system at a time, because our country is not designed for systemic change, meaning that there is not an easy decision-making process, or as an Intel foundation or an Intel corporation, we could go say, this is how we go drive systemic change throughout the entire pipeline. And so what we tried to do was then step back and decide to tackle what is the problem that we wanted to go fix. And so one of the things that was the most probably key learning for us when Paul Otellini, who is deceased now, but when he was the CEO of Intel, he actually served on President Barack Obama's Jobs Commission. And many of you may remember there was a whole focus on graduating 10,000 more engineers in the United States. That was the goal. And so the first meeting I went to, they were focused on K-12 education. But the goal was to graduate 10,000 more engineers within 4 years. And so reality is we needed to focus on K-12 education, but if you wanted to graduate 10,000 more engineers in 4 years, you really had to go look at those students who really had already put themselves in the pipeline. And what we recognized was the retention rate after the first year was a huge issue. It was a huge issue for minority students, and it was a huge issue for female students, and in particular, a huge issue for minority female students. And so we decided that we would focus a tremendous amount of resources on keeping students who had gone through the K-12 system, who had gotten into a university setting, and who had said they had an intent to become an engineer. We decided we wanted to surround them so that they wouldn't change their mind. High percentage were changing their mind after that first year. This is too hard. Those gatekeeper physics and calculus classes got their first C's in their life. This is too hard. I'm not smart enough. They did not have a resource or a supportive system around them that could say, stay with it. And so through our collaboration, and what we decided to do was we did a very deep collaboration with higher ed, with deans of engineering. We went after the media. We partnered with MTV, Black Entertainment Television, all about focusing. We partnered with NSF, ASE, totally focused on this one area. And what we learned was that we actually made a difference. The entire collaboration made a difference. But the learning was the amount of money it took, the amount of focus it took, is hard to scale from a corporate standpoint. And so as I look back now, I think, what is it about that retention? And we know that students change their mind. They start as a freshman, they think they're going to do one thing, and they change their mind. And we know they change their mind. And that's a natural thing. But the difference that we saw in engineering was you didn't have students changing their mind after the first year to go into engineering. So they would leave that thought and go do something else. But you didn't have somebody that came in and decided that they wanted to be a lawyer one day and then change their mind and go into engineering. So the numbers meant that we really had to focus there. As I step back and I think about all programs, and we looked at what GE was doing, which was phenomenal. IBM, phenomenal. We all partnered. I mean, most of your big tech companies, we have had at least 3 major collaborations where we've come together to do this. And that work is necessary. I look back and the reality is, without the work of all of you and without the work to date, we wouldn't be where we are. And we are graduating more African-American engineers in this country. We're graduating more African-American female engineers in this country. The challenge from a percentage standpoint, as we heard earlier, is more engineers are coming from outside of this country. And so our percentages is the same. And so if I step back and think now, what I would say is, in trying to drive systemic change in this, right, in looking at the conferences I attended 10 years ago, 20 years ago, attending this conference, the reality is I'm not sure if our work will ever truly be done. until we really begin to look at engineering, in my opinion, much like people look at the practice of law. I believe engineers have phenomenal skill sets. And the engineering workforce is everywhere. I sit on the Black Filmmakers Foundation board. Do you know how many people are making movies that actually are engineers? How many people are running construction companies that are actually engineers? How many people are doing all kinds of careers in this country that are actually engineers? They aren't engineering for Intel. They aren't engineering for GE. They aren't professors. They're using their engineering skill set, their problem solving, how you actually go and engineer something. And they're doing it in various ways. So I think the opportunity for us is to rethink what an engineering workforce really is, and to figure out ways that we can drive systemic change and how education is delivered from kindergarten all the way through to professors, so that engineering becomes a skill competency that all students, that then they can take and become engineers and work for Intel, GE, IBM, or be like major movie stars and go run movie studios, because that's where engineering is right now in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you all on the panel for your thoughts and great presentations. Christine, I got to say, I was really charged up about your third generation GE story, and I know there's been a lot of great work by a lot of other people. I also was at MIT along with Daryl Pines, and so it's a great group of people here that we're
Small world.
Yes. I just like to encourage all the participants to use the Q&A tool tab to ask your questions. I'll kick it off though with a thought. It was really interesting to see the focus, especially on the graduate and the pathway to the professors, as being important for students to envision themselves in a role like that, seeing a person like themselves. That's also important earlier on in the pathway and pipeline, and the role of mentorships all along this ecosystem, I think, is really important. It is an opportunity for engagement for companies like GE and Intel and others, for employees to be engaged as part of their volunteer activities, and it's very, very fulfilling. But could you comment on how these efforts might enhance and improve opportunities and practices around mentoring? And I'll just open it up.
I'll start on this because Intel continues to have a huge focus on our employees going into schools, particularly K-12 schools. And we've even had programs where we sent our employees into universities, and we had university professors come inside of Intel. We did a kind of a cross-sharing. I will tell you that we actually, back when Craig Barrett was our chairman and we were very deeply involved in education, we actually had proposals for Intel to send our employees into the public school system as math and science teachers. And we were going to fund it. And this goes into challenges of K-12 education and unions and what you can do and what you can't do. But what I will share with you, one of the most impactful volunteer efforts that we had that had really nothing to do with engineering. So one summer in Sacramento, we had a situation where we had brought a cohort of Black engineers from some of the HBCUs in to do internships in Folsom, California. For those of you that don't know Folsom, it's not a very diverse community. So you plop a fair amount of engineers that are Black into Folsom, and they don't necessarily have a community that they care about. And so the head of HR came to me and said, do you have anything for them to do? And I had just gotten a phone call from a community-based organization that we had a technology center with. And I said, well, maybe they can go mentor at that technology center because, they can teach children about computers. And so I called him and he said, well, do you even know how to play basketball, Roz? And I said, I don't know all that. I said, because I need some basketball coaches. Anyway, long story short, these engineers went into a community center and were basketball coaches for the summer. And you want to know why that was the most impactful thing for them? Because these young students learned that engineers played basketball, that engineers wore high tops, that engineers actually were real people. And as a result, then they started asking them about computers. And it was one of those things that you just realize a lot of kids don't understand what engineering is, and they don't think it's connected to them. So I think what that long story to tell you that we began to see that it was important for our engineers to go into schools and mentor in a variety of ways. Like we had one of our female engineers went in and coached young women on their art and fashion, right? Because art and fashion is now done through technology. So it just began to open up what it means for our employees and for us as adults who understand engineering to go in and help young people see it as not something that just nerds do or not something that people over there do.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think learning by example and by demonstration is important. When I talk about my time at GE, I remember meeting students at RPI who were undergrads, and my mother, who was working as a technical editor, they would take us on field trips, and we would meet these people. And like Rosalind said, it's wow, these are real people, and they go, and then being able to go to the dorm and hang out in the summers and take classes with folks that look like you that were really interested in it was really important. As I move forward in my career, the importance of not just peer-to-peer mentoring, but cross-cultural mentoring. As a faculty member, a lot of my mentors have been white males who have sewed into my life. I think that there are ways to celebrate. I was fortunate to get the Paisman Award and the AAAS Mentor Award. And part of that was because people mentored me and then I just passed it on. So I think creating a culture of mentoring is really important, and celebrating it and making it something that people get acknowledged for, whether it's faculty when they're going up for tenure or someone in a company if they get some type of an award. So I think acknowledging it is also important.
I really echo that in terms of how you not just find these champion mentors. I mean, there's individuals, probably like all of us on this screen, who enjoy mentoring, who our careers were shaped in part by the mentors we had. But mentoring is not a cultural element of higher education in most settings, or in engineering departments or other STEM departments. So creating the culture of mentoring is so important. That's what the USEMS, the program that I talked about earlier, is really trying to do. And it sounds really good on paper, right? They have some great models for team mentoring, having a peer mentor, 2 faculty mentors, one of whom is in your department, one of whom is outside, and then having a mentor who works for the program specifically, one of the coordinators, your student affairs person. And that on paper is really powerful. But even on these campuses where they're so focused on mentoring, it can be a real challenge to take that model and put it into practice and have it work really, really well, even when you're so intentional. So it really does come down to, like Christine said, incentives and rewards. And until we make mentoring a real incented practice in the professoriate, I don't think we're going to see the kind of change we want to see, and until we really provide the right level of continuous training for what it means to mentor in culturally competent ways. Not just a one-off training, but communities of mentors that work together for ongoing learning. I don't think we'll see exactly what we want to see. So it goes back to that systems approach, that it's not one thing or another, it's making it a part of the system on the whole.
Great thoughts. Well, I want to thank the participants for adding Q&A to the queue here. Yeah. I'll just take the first one here and provide a little bit of context, maybe. do any of the speakers have thoughts on transferring students into engineering when you look at pathways, especially? I mean, it's a flux outwards. But if there was, and Rosalind, you work in film now, and I think about the impact that visualization and computing has had on the film industry. I mean, any thoughts on how we might increase awareness in other parts of the campus on just what cool stuff happens with engineering and create that flow in the other direction?
It's interesting. One of the major ahas for me was on some university campuses, the engineering department, the computer science department weren't necessarily they weren't talking to each other as much as we thought that they would be. This is what I'll tell you. We commissioned a study, gosh, it probably was 6 years ago at Intel. And the interesting thing that came back, which you guys I'm sure all know, was the number one factor that indicated whether or not a student was going to go into engineering, regardless of socioeconomic status, that is connected to socioeconomic status, was whether when they were growing up, if they had a consistent adult present in their lives that were already connected to the field. That was the number one factor. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about that is, why is that? Because you can translate it, right? It covers up the gaps that we all spend an amount of time on. When I think about what's going on in film, what's going on in fashion, what's going on really in any industry, it comes down to everything happens through technology. We're using technology right now. And the difference is engineers, and what we need is more people that understand how to make it, how to create it. And that is still the essence. So when we focused on STEM, what we found out was we were investing a lot of doctors in this world, because yes, science and math was great, but then they'd go and be doctors. So I think there is a significant amount, particularly in Dow has done some work. Some of your beauty companies have done a lot of work. Barbie's done some work, right, in terms of trying to get that. But what I would say is this: I could think that there could be better branding on what you called engineering degrees. I personally believe that if there was one thing that you could put movies and creatives on, is rename and rebrand engineering degrees. Because I think people hear, oh, I have a degree in electrical engineering. Well, what is that? Oh, I have a degree in chemical engineering. It'd be interesting if you rebranded like electrical engineering with a specialization in movie something, chemical engineering with a specialization in makeup creation. I mean, I honestly think that is where there might be an opportunity to make it, to connect the dots for those young people who don't have a constant adult presence in their lives, that will connect the dots for them.
Great thoughts. Christine, Laurel, any other further thoughts in that regard?
No, I thought that was a great suggestion.
Well.
Okay, great. Let's just move on down then to the next question. As a PWI, how do we learn more about best practices from MSIs, and how do we build these connections? Looks like many people at this conference are from majority serving institutions.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that one. That's an excellent question. We often forget that the majority of the students who get their PhDs, I believe, I don't know the exact numbers, receive their first in technology areas, receive their first degree from a minority serving institution. And those institutions, I did not go to a minority serving institution. However, I do know that they have an amazing track record for mentoring and nurturing and creating cultures of support for students, for them to go on and be successful in the technology realm. There is a lot that we can learn from them. There are programs that are having conversations about this. I believe I saw something within the National Academies actually on either HBCUs or minority serving institutions. I know there have been a few institutions, Morgan State and some others, that have been highlighted with some programs. through the national academies in terms of conversations. So I think it's really important. That's a great question. I think we have to keep asking that question to make sure that we have the diversity in the room, as you pointed out in this. I could go on, but because of time, I will also say NSF has a number of programs that are focused on MSIs, minority serving institutions as well. We've been having conversations in engineering about something specific in that realm as well, but I can't talk about it, right? So, but anyway.
I might just add the report. I think one of the reports, perhaps, Christine, you're talking about is a Sloan-funded report on MSIs that I also co-chaired when I was in my previous job at the American Council on Education, and it's an Academy's report. So everyone, I'll pop it in the chat when we're done with the panel here.
See, people are paying attention. I saw it.
But one thing that we coined in that committee and in the report, not even coined because it's not like we're the first people who said it, but there's a level of intentionality that you find on these campuses. And other people talk about it as meeting students where they are or being student-centered, but there's a different attitude about talent development on many of these campuses that really set them apart, that the rest of higher education can learn from. But I would point people to that report, and there's other literature out there, but I'd also mention the call that we have out right now is all about forming those very partnerships. And they have to be meaningful partnerships. The token partnerships can be spotted a mile away. They have to be two-way partnerships, which is something that the MSI community has unfortunately experienced as not being that in many of the partnerships that have been formed for the purposes of applying for grants and things. So that report anyway offers some nice feedback about what it takes to model these institutions, but also form those partnerships.
Yeah, I would say that they need to be authentic. That's another word I would add to what you just said, authentic partnerships. And again, there are a lot of people who are doing work in this realm, but it needs to be authentic because there's been enough people coming to HBCUs at the last minute to get them on a grant. And then when they get the grant, where's the funding? That's not with my NSF hat on, right? So, we really need to be authentic and learn and have folks who are from HBCUs at the table designing the programs that are going to be relevant to the culture of the community that we're trying to impact.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Just to follow up on the queue of questions here, thanks to Rosalind for a great talk, and just a comment that there was a desire to see a significant increase in internships, undergraduate and graduate in industry. Any thoughts on how we might make that happen?
So that was and is part of the Diversity and Technology Initiative, where we had about 100 companies that doubled the amount of internships that they were offering. And so we all know that internships are critical, not just for retention, but in some cases for financial support, but also an ability to have a really strong resume to get jobs. What I thought I would do is also there's a question in here. I think Tyrone asked that there's something about you don't have to be a genius to be an engineer. And I think this is actually a question we in industry and we in academia should really say, is that true, right? So the industry I came from first started with, you don't have to have a GPA. Then all of a sudden was, we have to have at least a 3.5 GPA and you have to graduate from these tier 1 schools. Now we're kind of overall industry kind of going over there. So the real question is that true? Could we all support a group of students who were C students going through engineering school? If they got a D in physics the first year, would we all still tell them that they're smart enough to be engineers? See, I think we get back and decide, because I do think there is this perception, wrong or right, that engineering is for really smart people and it's really hard. And even when you come into corporations, we role model it, we amplify that, And so if that's true, then let's just be real about it and go after the smartest students of color we can find and do all the branding in the world to convince them to be an engineer instead of, doing all the other things that they can do. Because a brilliant student can go do whatever she wants to do. But if we're willing to say, you know what, it's okay, because I know a whole lot of people running huge technology companies who have delivered tremendous IP and delivered tremendous value to this country, and they weren't A students in college. So not even B students in college. So I think it's something for us to think about differently, because and so the reason why that's kind of internships is a lot of times in order to get an internship, you have to have a certain level GPA. In order to stay in university, you have to have a certain level GPA. So I think this is, if it's real, if you don't have to be a genius, then there's this whole idea that everyone's smart and everyone can do engineering. And if we really believe that, then everyone should be able to get an internship. And as somebody who came from a company where we strive to be diverse and inclusive, we still had a tremendous amount of standards that we held up that were very GPA based. And I just have to be candid about that. I think we're better, but industry perpetuates this. It's not just academia. So I don't know if you guys disagree or agree, but I do think it would be a good discussion to continue to have.
Totally agree.